Hello, we're back again with the Doctrine of Sin. Today we're going to take a look at original sin. The doctrine of original sin. What is it? What does it mean? And how has it influenced us over the many years of Christianity? Well, let's give a quick definition of original sin so then we can be off and running. Original sin is the belief that all humans share, one way or another, in Adam's sin. That his sin has affected us. And it has passed on to posterity. Most Christians, I can't think of any Christians who don't believe in original sin if it's defined that way. But there's also another component of original sin that often gets attached to it called original guilt. And original guilt is the belief that all human beings are liable for punishment for Adam's sin. It's quite possible to believe in original sin and deny original guilt. Some Christians believe in both. Some Christians believe in only one. Now, what I want to do is take a moment or two and talk about how various groups of Christians have treated original sin down through time. The first group is the Greek Fathers. The Greek Fathers are the early Christian fathers who spoke Greek, lived generally in Egypt, Syria, Asia Minor, Greece, and the Holy Land. They were the ones who were predominant teachers of the first 5 to 6 centuries of Christianity. For the Greek Fathers, and I want to read this just so I don't mess it up and I don't steer you wrong. For the Greek Fathers, sin is directly linked to mortality, which is inherited from Adam. Because Adam sinned, Adam died. Now, we talked about death a little bit in the last video clip, but for the Greek Fathers, when they speak of death, they mean physical death. Because Adam ate of the tree of knowledge, he physically died. He became mortal. He was created to be immortal. He was created to never die. But because he ate, he died. And therefore, one of the things that gets passed on to Adam's children, that is all of us, is the state of being mortal. We will die. John Cassian called it this: a loss of incorruption. This is what he defined original sin to be. And he is an excellent summary of the Greek Father's position. Said this: he called original sin a loss of incorruption and immortality, as well as that of supernatural knowledge and eternal bliss, and the consequent enslavement to the devil. So that's what original sin is, generally, to the Greek Fathers. It's a loss of incorruption. It's a loss of immortality. It's a loss of supernatural knowledge. It's a loss of eternal bliss. And it is enslavement to the devil. Those are the 5 things that make up the Greek view, the early Greek Fathers' view of original sin. For the Greek Fathers, guilt is personal, not hereditary. In other words, from a Greek Father standpoint, you and I possess original sin because we possess the things that are a consequence of Adam's sin, but we do not possess his guilt. Our guilt is our own. I am guilty of what I have done. I am not guilty of what he has done. Okay? So the Greek Fathers affirmed original sin, but did not affirm original guilt. Guilt is personal. Guilt is not hereditary. But the Greek Fathers were not really, they did not follow the view of original sin that we'll talk about in a moment, that often gets passed down to we evangelical Protestants. Their view is more of what I would call an original punishment view. To them, even though we take on the punishment, well, I shouldn't say that. Even though we take on the consequences of Adam's sin, we are not guilty of his sin, nor did we participate in his sin. That's something that the Greek fathers hold almost universally, as opposed to, and I'll leave it there for now because it will make more sense as I explain with Augustine. Augustine was a father of the church, but he was not Greek. He was Latin. He was from North Africa on the west side in modern Tunisia, very acquainted with Rome, was saved in Milan, thought like a Roman. Augustine believed that Hebrews 7, if you're familiar with Hebrews 7, it is where Abraham paid tithes to Melchizedek. And it's an attempt by the author of the Hebrews to show that the priesthood of Melchizedek is superior to the priesthood of Aaron. And the way he makes his argument is that Abraham pays tithes to Melchizedek, which means Melchizedek is greater than Abraham. But Levi, who is the father of the Israelite priesthood, is the great-grandson of Abraham, because it goes Abraham to Isaac to Jacob to Levi. And because he is the great-grandson of Abraham, he is not greater than Abraham. So therefore, Abraham is less than Melchizedek, Levi is less than or equal to Abraham, therefore Levi is less than Melchizedek, therefore the Aaron's priesthood is inferior to Melchizedek's priesthood, because as the writer of Hebrews says, Levi was in the loins of Abraham when he paid tithes. Similarly, Augustine believed that all human beings were in the loins of Adam when he sinned. Therefore, his sin, in a very real sense, becomes our sin. We were physically present and physically active. An organic connection between our sin and Adam's sin exists because it's all hereditary. And the union of the human race in Adam is therefore the foundation for Augustine's view of original sin. It's original because we all actually participated in it, because we were all in Adam. And it is also original guilt because since we were there anyway, his guilt becomes ours. And that's what Augustine viewed as original sin and original guilt. Now, Augustine had his own hang-ups. He was pretty big into hereditary. He had his own sexual hang-ups, and he believed that original sin was passed through the act of sexual intercourse. That act alone was evil and base, and so therefore, that because it leads to conception, that's where original sin comes from. I'm not buying that. I don't think that that's true for a moment. But like I said, he had his own hang-ups, he had his own issues, and they clouded his judgment from time to time. So therefore, Augustine's default setting for human beings is a humanity created and fallen. And that is vitally important to remember. The default setting for humanity, as far as Augustine is concerned, is humanity created and fallen. Augustine says it this way. Before the fall, human beings were posse non peccare, able to not sin. Once the fall occurs, human beings are non posse non peccare, not possible, not able not to sin. But then after the resurrection and the recreation of our bodies, we will be non posse peccare, not able to sin. Not only this, but this will add to our understanding later when we get to sin and salvation, the doctrines of sin and salvation. Or rather, just the doctrine of salvation is what I meant to say. There's a class on sin and salvation, and I'm thinking double. He believes that fallen humanity can do no good whatsoever without the aid of divine grace, because humanity is this fallen mass in Adam. Once Adam sins, he all of a sudden now is no good whatsoever. Everything in him is no good whatsoever. That makes all of us no good whatsoever. So therefore, the only good we can do, because we're no good whatsoever, is by the aid of divine grace. The human will is in bondage to sin, and sin can never will itself out on its own. Augustine has what we would call an infralapsarian view of humanity. If you're familiar with that term, it's a term from the high scholastic Reformed era of the 17th century, meaning that humanity is viewed as a created and fallen entity in terms of God's eternal plan and eternal decree. I am not an infralapsarian, but that's a good word to describe Augustine. God sees humanity as sinful and fallen and judges accordingly. That's very, very, very important because it's a statement about how God views people. He views people as a sinful, fallen mass. Now that's an assumption, folks, and I think it's an erroneous assumption, but it's an assumption that holds sway in Western Christian theology, both Roman Catholic and Protestant. And it's something that you probably grew up with, and it seems second nature to you, that God sees you as this filthy, vile, wretched sinner. Well, there's some truth to that, but it's not the whole truth. It's not the only thing that describes you. So beware when oversimplifying anthropology like that. All humanity, according to Augustine, then, is what he called a massa damnata, a damnable mass, a damnable lump that deserves only to be damned to hell forever. Now, see, catch that word in there? Deserves. Deserves. Think about that word for a little bit. Tell me how that word belongs in a homoousion based theology. If your answer is it doesn't, you're absolutely right. We have just shifted the playing field from God's love to a view of justice that is not biblical. It's not relational. It's Roman. It is mechanical. It is crime and punishment. Beware of that. Add to this, Augustine believed, because humans can't do anything without divine grace, that those who are saved are elected unconditionally by God, that he chooses those whom he will save, and those are the only ones who are saved, because otherwise, without his choosing and his enabling grace, no one would be saved. So the one explanation for Augustine for how anyone is saved and comes to know life is that God has unconditionally chosen them. The rest of humanity is left in its state of fallenness and to go to hell as is just. There's one of my facial expressions again. Now, traducianism, which we've already talked about in anthropology, traducianism now becomes an effective way of explaining how sinfulness is transferred. It's the transmission of original sin and guilt, and it becomes a paternal traducianism in that sin and guilt is passed through the father and not the mother, which allows Augustine to uphold the virgin birth and Jesus' immaculate sinlessness, which we'll discuss when we talk about Jesus, that's not what it really is at all. But it worked for Augustine. Augustine's archenemy in terms of nature and grace was Pelagius. Pelagius was a British monk who objected to Augustine's confessions. Now, Augustine comes on the scene, writes confessions. Pelagius, even though he lives in Britain, he thinks a lot like a Greek. And so he has a Greek view of original sin, does not believe in original guilt, does not believe that the only good humans can do is aided by divine grace. He believes that we are still in the image of God, the image is still retained, we're still able to do good things, even though meriting salvation still is out the window, even for Pelagius. Pelagius is reading Confessions, and he comes to this passage in Augustine's writings where it says, "Give what you command, and command what you will," speaking to God. And Pelagius, in a hillbilly expression, just jumps stiff-legged over that. He cannot cannot swallow that from Augustine, because to Pelagius, humanity has original death, has original fallenness, but is in no way crippled and maimed in nature as Augustine believes. So therefore, Pelagius would think that if we do good, the goodness arises out of us. And so he goes on the offensive against Augustine and his what he believes to be a completely deterministic and fatalistic view of give what you command and command what you will. The upshot of it all is that Pelagius, or at least the way he is portrayed in history, and now it's really hard to separate fact from legend, denied that people are complicit in Adam's sin at all. He believed Adam to be only a bad example, and that we all have sufficiently free and enabled wills to will not to sin. Adam willed to sin. He messed up, but the rest of us, we can do this and do it the right way without him. Pelagius believed that our wills were sufficiently powerful and our abilities sufficiently intact that we could will what was good and do it. And so therefore, he stands very much outside of the tradition of Augustine, and Augustine aimed both barrels at Pelagius. And Pelagius was wrong. He was wrong to believe that Adam was a bad example. He was wrong to believe that humans can will themselves out of sin. Those things are wrong, and he was condemned even in the East by the Council of Ephesus in 431. But he struck a nerve with some folks, and even though he was a lot wrong, there was still a little bit right. And the little bit right was the idea that we're not a completely fallen mass. We are fallen, but we're still made in the image of God. And any responsible anthropology that is fully Christian needs to hold those two truths together at the same time. Yes, we are sinful, but yes, we are fearfully and wonderfully made. Yes, we're fallen, but yes, we're still in God's image. Yes, we may deserve punishment, but yes, God still loves us. And it's that love that motivated our creation in the first place. And it's the love of God that is more powerful even than human sin. And we need to always keep our anthropology in balance. That for every time we say that we're a sinful mass, but we're still created good, that we may be fallen, but we are still the apple of God's eye and his created ambassadors on this earth. So all anthropological statements that concern human nature and the grace that attends to it need to be balanced with one another so that we don't run afoul of saying or of unduly emphasizing one aspect of anthropology, even in this sinful world, at the expense of the other. Next important name in Nature and Grace, as far as original sin goes, is John Calvin. Calvin follows Augustine in all of the above, except for his realist position on original sin, and except for the fall being the real source of human damnation. To Augustine, the real source of human damnation is God's choice. Augustine is what we would call a double predestinarian. He believes that God has elected some to be saved and some to be damned. And that election occurred prior to, or at least logically prior to, the permission of the fall. So therefore the damned are damned whether the fall occurs or not, which is a really scary thought. That's just bizarre. But it's John Calvin. To Calvin, the secret election of God is the reason behind all salvation and all election. And that view is supralapsarian. Calvin and those who followed him, rather than taking that realist view where all people are present in Adam, take what is called a federalist view, which means that Adam is our representative. Just as our government here in the United States is called a federal government because it is government by representation, so Adam represents all of the people in his beginning of humanity. So wherever Adam goes, everybody else goes. Because Adam sinned, everybody else is deemed sinful. One represented all. So Adam's sin made everybody sinners. Calvin goes further than Augustine here also, and I'll read this, in saying that God willed the fall. In his book, The Secret Providence of God, he writes, quote, "I acknowledge that this is my doctrine, that Adam fell not only by the permission of God, but by his secret counsel, and that all his descendants are fallen, being dragged into eternal destruction." So, according to Calvin, God willed the fall. That's what he wanted. He wanted human beings to be sinful. And I know Calvin is greatly praised among Reformed theologians, but goodness gracious, this man misses the heart of God right here. He misses the homoousion. Just falls in love with Augustine too much. Calvin taught total depravity. All human faculties are touched by the fall, and that human beings are unable to respond without grace. God's regenerating is monergistic, mono ergo one worker, and his monergistic grace is required to overcome the condition of being dead in trespasses and sins, which really is just following Augustine. It's not really anything original. The original contributions of Calvin are double predestination and God willing the fall. Calvin's successor in Geneva was Theodore Beza, and Beza had a pupil named James Arminius. Arminius ran afoul of the Calvinist party line in Geneva when he got back home to the Netherlands. Arminius was Dutch. Long story about Arminius and Dutch and the Netherlands and political intrigue and state churches, and it's really interesting church history, but doesn't concern us so much here, so I'll skip it. Arminius holds to original sin but denies original guilt. He believes that prevenient grace, which is God's grace given because of Christ, is able to remove the original sin of the fall and restore human will so that we are able to choose the good. It's still the grace of God, but it's a universal grace that allows all human beings to choose the good and to choose to be saved. He believes that election is conditional. That is, that God elects based on his foreknowledge of who will hear him. Again, that gets us down to today. I don't really like Augustine's view. I don't like Calvin's view, and I'm not crazy about Arminius. I really believe the Eastern Fathers have the best view. That idea of original death, that we are under the law of sin and death, that Adam's sin brought forth death, and we are under the curse of death, and we are born under the curse of death. I think that's a much better explanation than to try to say that we are really participants in Adam's sin, or that we are federally participants in Adam's sin. I think it explains the biblical data best, and I think it doesn't have the negative side effects of original guilt. We've talked about those, we've hammered on those. If we are guilty of Adam's sin, then every human being is guilty of something that they didn't personally do. It also makes it very difficult to uphold a reasonable person and nature distinction, because it is the nature that transfers the problem, not the person, and therefore guilt becomes natural rather than personal, and then we run afoul of all kinds of strange things. I just want to close this video clip. I know it's been long, but I want to close it with a thought. And this is why I have so much difficulty sometimes resonating with my Protestant past. Here's a quote from Martin Luther. We need to begin with God by acknowledging we deserve hell. Now, you're going to realize that flies in the face of what we're doing theologically here with our statement of the homoousion, the oneness between the Father and the Son. If we really walk on that paradigm, then we can't begin with God by saying we deserve hell. But anyway, I want to match him with that great theologian Clint Eastwood in the movie Unforgiven, when he's standing there getting ready to shoot Gene Hackman, and he just snarls up his lip like this and he says, "Deserve got nothing to do with it." And that's something I want you to remember. Deserve has got nothing to do with it. It's not about what we deserve. It's about who God is. I want that to sink into our skulls. It is not about what we deserve. Deserve is not front and center here. Who God is front and center. He is the creator of the human race. He is the lover of the human race. Yes, we've sinned. I fully acknowledge that. But God ain't moved. He has not changed. We have changed. And in turn, we have projected our own evil upon him and turned him into something he's not. The truth of the matter is, and this truth is so beautifully revealed in the incarnation of Jesus Christ and the gospel that attaches itself to it, that God so loved the world. Yes, he knew how sinful the world was. Yes, he knows what our problems are. Yes, he knows all those things. But God so loved the world regardless. It's not about what we deserve. It's about the love of God, and it's about him guarding over his creation and fighting against its own willful destruction. That's what we want to remember when we talk about original sin and original guilt and original death. That it's original death is the right answer. Any other thing turns God into someone who either is motivated for our ill or who just basically doesn't care. I hate to hear theologians say that, God would not be any different if he willed the destruction of every human being. Yes, he would. He created us for fellowship with him. He didn't create just some of us for fellowship with him. He created an entire race of beings for fellowship with him. We sinned. Yeah, I get that. But he's not going to let that sin stop him. And he's determined to save all who will be saved. So, I think original death explains this the best. And I think it's best to see death as this loss of life, and what we have as children of Adam are the natural consequences of the death that is produced by his sin. And I think that's the best way to understand original sin. So next time we will take a practical look at sin as we continue our march through the doctrine of sin. Have a great day, and we'll see you later. Bye.